Welcome to the Valor Flight Crew podcast, hosted by Echo and brought to you by Vertical Helicasts and Vertical Valor magazine. In this two-part episode, join hosts Mike Fadale and Blake Shrider for an in-depth interview with Rhett Draehn. Rhett is a paramedic and the current safety director at CareFlite in Texas, and his story is nothing short of extraordinary. Back in 2012, Rhett and his crew were involved in a devastating helicopter crash while responding to pick up a patient from a scene call. Thankfully, all crew members survived, and Rhett is here today to walk us through the moments leading up to the crash, the immediate aftermath, and his long road to recovery, both physically and mentally. But this isn't just a story of survival. It's about resilience, the evolution of aviation safety, and the critical role of crew resource management in preventing future incidents. Rhett's insights serve as a powerful reminder of the shared responsibility we all have in ensuring safety in the skies. So buckle in. This conversation is one you won't want to miss. Thank you to our sponsors, Metro Aviation, Precision Aviation Group, and Spectrum Aeromed. As a brief disclaimer to our audience, listener discretion is advised, as this episode includes discussions of a real-life helicopter crash and its aftermath. We recognize this may be a sensitive topic, and these discussions and personal experiences are shared only to foster learning and awareness surrounding aviation safety in the HEMS industry. If you or a fellow flight crew member is struggling, know you are not alone. EchoFast, other peer support groups, and or your local EAP and counseling services are here to help. Stay tuned for an incredibly impactful episode on the Valor Flight Crew podcast.
Welcome to the Valor Flight Crew podcast. Brought to you by Vertical Helicasts and Vertical Valor magazine. Produced in partnership with Echo, Every Coast Helicopter Operations. The Valor Flight Crew podcast promotes the personnel and life-saving equipment behind helicopter air ambulance services. Join hosts Mike Fadale and Blake Shrider for in-depth interviews and expert insights from air medical personnel, pilots, communication specialists, and maintenance crews who play critical roles in airborne emergency response.
Line 1 accepting.
Copy, line 1, gotcha, accepting. You're going to be talking to Rhett Draehn 1 on LCEMS.
Welcome to the Valor Flight Crew podcast. My name is Mike Fadale, and I'm here with Blake Shrider, and we are your hosts for the VFC podcast. Blake, how are you doing today?
Doing good, Mike. How about you?
I am doing great. I am counting down the hours right now until vacation, and I cannot wait to go somewhere warm because it is a raging 19, 20 degrees here today, and it's been cold and windy all week.
I really don't have any room to complain. We're sitting at a high of 82 today. It's nice and sunny, a little windy, you know. I'm wearing long sleeves just because the air conditioner is a little high.
You're just
today,
trying to fit in with us northerners out here.
I try.
Awesome. Welcome to the VFC podcast again today, and we have a very impactful podcast for you today. Really looking forward to having discussions here. Our guest is going to be Rhett Draehn from CareFlite in Texas. And this is extremely impactful due to the fact that Rhett was in a helicopter crash back in 2012 and thankfully survived the crash and is here to tell us about it today. He is a flight paramedic and current safety director at his program down in Texas. And this crash happened back in 2012. It was September 30th of 2012. And Rhett and his crew were responding to pick up a patient. Weather had deteriorated for them. Pilot began an IFR flight plan, and shortly after that, their aircraft ended up crashing in a field just outside of Eastland. So this episode is certainly going to be one for the record books for us, as far as being able to have discussion and talk through some of Rhett's experience during the crash, after the crash, some lessons learned along the way, and how it's really changed his practice and the industry practice since then. So without further ado, I'd like to give a big warm welcome to Rhett Draehn from CareFlite. How are you, Rhett?
I'm good. I appreciate you guys having me here today. This is going to be an awesome conversation and a great time, sharing things about this with you and your listeners. Like you said, there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and it's very impactful for anybody who ever really I talk to about it. So I appreciate you inviting me to share this with you guys.
And we're honored to have you on the podcast today. And I think this is something that is going to really resonate very loudly with our listeners. And we're grateful that you're willing to share the story with us. and your experiences through everything. I can't imagine being in your shoes and going through an experience like this. Certainly being part of Echo and having some exposure and experience with FAST, have been able to provide, some small scale assistance, but being in those shoes is something that is entirely out of my wheelhouse. And we really appreciate you taking the time to have that conversation.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So before we kind of get into it, Rhett, if you don't mind, give us a little bit of background about yourself, your flight experience, where you're at, and what kind of missions you guys are doing down there.
I come from the medical side of the house. So I've been in EMS for about 25 years, did a little stint in the fire department, but the patient care side of things really called to me. So I left that to the wayside and left the fire career, moved up here about almost 20 years ago to work at CareFlite as a flight paramedic. I spent some time in leadership and back out in the field, and then, we'll talk through the crash stuff. But it's almost cheesy, I guess, to really talk about how I got to this point. So when I was a kid, my dad was a pediatrician in a small town, and on the weekends he'd have to go to the hospital and do rounds and stuff, like see some of his patients. And every once in a while I'd go with him, and there would be a helicopter there, from the closest provider, which was probably a 2-hour drive away. And, I was just enamored by that. And, I never thought that I would make it to the point where I was going to be a flight paramedic, but I've thoroughly enjoyed that. This career path has been amazing. I think everybody who flies EMS, really in any capacity, it's like a drug. You get hooked on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can't imagine doing anything besides it. And so, as weird as it may sound, talking about the subject matter that we're talking about, I feel very fortunate to have had the career in this field that I have.
I think a lot of us have pretty similar stories. I know, like, I fell in love with helicopters as a kid. I think I was, 5 years old, and I think I've told the story before, but my mom took me down and showed me the helicopters, and she knew one of the pilots, and I absolutely fell in love with it. I was obsessed with helicopters, and it didn't matter which one was flying over the house because we lived right in the flight plan into the hospital. I knew which helicopter it was, knew which direction they were coming from. I knew everything about the aircraft. Like, I was just obsessed as a kid. So I think a lot of us have some of those similar cheesy stories, but it's what makes this job not a job, right?
Right. And no matter where you are, still, if you hear a helicopter,
oh yeah,
you just stop
eyes
whatever
to
you're
the sky
doing.
every time.
Look up in the stand.
Every single time. Rhett, you've been involved with Echo for a little bit now, correct?
A couple of years, yeah.
A couple of years now. So how did you end up getting involved in Echo, and what kind of roles are you playing there?
It always seemed that when there was a Echo conference or something going on, like I had something else going on. And a few years ago, when the conference was in Austin, it just so worked out that I was free that week, and I was like, I'm gonna go check out Echo. And the feeling and the vibe that you get when you go to an Echo event is not like any other industry conference or meeting. And so, it kind of pulls you in, right? And it's a lot of people that want to make the industry better, whether it be from a clinical standpoint, safety standpoint, mental health, leadership. The people at Echo, they're in it for the right reason. And so, back up a few years, I was fortunate enough to have a couple of people from the FAST team come and talk at one of our CRM training here at CareFlite. And so we got to talking, and eventually when the Echo safety team was kind of being formed and then kind of being reinvigorated a couple of years ago, I was invited to be part of that. And, it's a small group of amazing people from really all over aviation, right? You've got military, civilian, you got pilots who are involved, you got clinicians who are involved. And so it's a great group of people.
We're certainly happy to have you as part of the team. And again, thank you for coming on and chatting with us today. Before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of everything here, we usually like to do a little bit of an icebreaker. Blake, you want to take that away?
Oh, Mike, I almost forgot.
I always remind you.
Yeah, thank you. So, Rhett, we try to ask all our guests, what was the last thing you were listening to on your phone? So if you pull it up, let us know what was the last song on your playlist. And don't be embarrassed. It's okay if
No, I heard this. So I listened to the first episode the other day.
So you were prepared, is what you were saying.
I had my notes, right? I had my notes for this whole thing. And that was a huge curveball, right? And so I feel like the me that goes to work is a different me than what leaves from work. So I'm going to start with that disclaimer.
All right.
When my go to work is a lot heavier than my go home. It's like,
Okay.
it's
Makes
like
sense.
hype music. Hang on, I'm trying to get to what my Spotify is without it like turning on and playing. Okay, today wasn't bad. It was kind of Texas dirt road country. That was, I think it's because it's icy, not icy here, but like they canceled school and a lot of offices closed. So it was low traffic day. So it was pretty easy drive to work. So soothing music coming to work. Most of the time it's pretty like Metallica heavy, a lot of rock heavy.
Five Finger Death Punch, you know, something in
There's
there.
some of that in
absolutely.
there.
Yeah.
Some days, I'm not going to lie, some days there's a lot of rap music, but going home is more something like Pink Floyd, just mellow stuff. So
Nice.
I'm all over the place.
Mine this time was I don't even remember what the song is. I'm just looking at my playlist, but it's "Part of Your World" by Hallie. I have no idea. I don't
sounds
remember
great.
listening to it.
It sounds very pleasant.
Yeah, something like that.
You know, just given the current weather climate around, I've been kind of into my summer mood. I've been listening to kind of our boat jams playlist. So the last song I was listening to was "So Many Reasons" by the Elevators. So I'm kind of all ready for summer, as we talked about earlier with the weather. So sorry for everybody freezing up there.
You a fan of yacht rock?
I don't think I've ever heard of yacht rock.
Man, you're missing out.
Oh, I think I have something to research after this for sure.
All right, so we mentioned that you're here to talk about the crash that you were involved in 2012. Rhett, if you don't mind just telling us a little bit about the day of the crash and the events kind of leading up to the flight. I imagine it was probably a pretty normal report to work kind of day for you, but take us through, you know, what happened in the couple hours or days before the crash.
You know, I was thinking about that, and I think the undertone of this is you think about Swiss cheese, and people talk about that in all different facets, but you don't really know what plays into it until after the fact, right? And so, you know, there's a lot of these things that, like you said, are just the mundane, everyday things, but they're things that were not causal, but contributing factors in this. The night before, it was a Saturday night, I got called and said, hey, you know, your base is going to be out of service for maintenance. I need you to go to another base that was basically from the base where I worked to this base was the farthest distance between two of our bases. So in short, I'd been there like once before, you know, so unfamiliar territory, unfamiliar crew, unfamiliar pilots. Add to that the Sunday morning that I was going down there, and I think the day kind of plays into it too. Sunday morning that I was going down there, you know, overcast, spotty showers, just one of these like low weather days where a lot of times you think, oh man, this is going to be an easy day. I'm going to go, we're going to be socked in all day and not going to be anything to do. But then on the other side, you know, it was an IFR base. We had IFR pilots, IFR qualifications. So there was the slight chance that if everything lined up right, that we would be able to do an instrument flight. The culture was that, you know, this far remote base was the IFR base. They did the most IFR flights. They had more of those like gotcha kind of weather conditions around there. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
certain geography. And so maybe had a little false sense of security that, you know, this is, if we do IFR flight, this is going to be the best place to do it. So, you know, show up, you know, the flight nurse who I was with was a very seasoned employee. I think at the time, that person had been here for about 17 years. At the time, just for context, I was at CareFlite for about 7 at that point, and the pilot was a career pilot. You know, so nobody knew that was their base, so they knew the area. So we get down there, you know, we do our morning briefing like everybody does, and Sundays are the days that we basically take everything out of the aircraft, detail the aircraft, put everything back in. So, you know, we do our briefing, talk about the potential for IFR flying, get all of our ducks in a row, and everybody's feeling good. We went out and we were doing our Sunday detail, and the flight nurse and I were catching up because we previously we had seen each other, at the helipad in Fort Worth several times dropping off patients. So we knew one another. So we're just catching up on things that are going on while we're cleaning the aircraft. And, about an hour and a half, 2 hours into our shift, we get requested to go on this scene call to pick up a patient that was about 75-ish miles away. We have a conversation about, what's the weather like here? We have weather reporting. The nearest weather reporting to that location was a significant distance away, and both of them were marginal, both legal to fly VFR, just we didn't know what was in between. It sounded like we had this solid plan where add more fuel so that we could make our alternate. Talk about we don't need a flight plan right now, but at the time we had 121 dispatchers, and so they could file flight plans for us. They file a flight plan. We put on fuel. We take off. We're flying just below the clouds on our way out there, just like it would be a normal, just a normal flight, little scuddy weather, nothing illegal. We're flying well within our VFR means with our flight plan. And so, at the beginning, everything's going good.
Thank you to our sponsor, Spectrum AeroMed. Spectrum AeroMed is your trusted partner in aeromedical solutions. Experience safety and innovation with their customized interiors, designed for both rotor and fixed-wing aircraft. Elevate your patient care with Spectrum AeroMed. For more information, visit spectrum-aeromed.com.
You're 35 minutes into this flight that everything's normal, nothing unexpected. And so what do you do naturally? You ease into it, right? Let your guard down a little bit. You're comfortable, smooth sailing. And so, that's kind of when the real immediate, the causal things happen. But all of these other things, they play a role in it. When you talk, and I think we'll talk later about, the CRM factors and the expectations and things like that. But so that's kind of the mindset that we're in, right? It was just another normal day and another normal flight, except for I was at a new base with a new crew, new pilot. To me, it was all new.
Right.
And so that environment. So I think at this point, the best thing that was going on was I had a little bit maybe heightened sense of awareness.
Sure.
Just because of the unfamiliar things that were going on, but still nothing to cause alarm, right?
Sure. It was just to kind of touch on some of the points that you were talking about there, being that it's an IFR base and whatnot. Blake, I know you said your program is starting to do IFR now as well, but it's still something that's relatively new to you. I know my program, we're typically about a third of our flights end up being IFR. How many IFR flights did your program do? And was it something that you guys, what I'm getting at is, if you've never flown IFR before, it's a very kind of nerve-wracking experience. You're not seeing anything that's in front of you or around you. And all of a sudden you just, it's like magic. You just show up at your location and somehow are supposed to figure out where you're supposed to land. And so if it's something that you're not really used to, it's really easy to get, to get spatial disorientation, or things just don't look right or feel like normal. Is this something that, was a pretty typical flight for you? Were you comfortable in the IFR environment? Should you guys have to go that way? And how often do you guys do IFR flights in your program?
This was back in the day where IFR was looked at as, at least at our program, it was looked at more of a, if you need it, it's there, as opposed to it's part of your tools and you should use it all the time so that you're good at it. So that between then and now, I think industry-wide that shift has been made where you've got more advanced aircraft, you got more advanced autopilot systems. And so the goal should be you fly instruments as much as you can. So you build that proficiency and that comfort level. And to your point earlier, the first IFR flight that I ever went on was from our Dallas base, which is just south of downtown Dallas. If you've ever been in this area, it was a repositioning flight to Love Field, which is basically on the other side of downtown Dallas.
Okay.
And you go through this and you're like, I take off pointing one direction, south. You feel all these weird feelings. You have clouds all around you.
Yep.
And to your point, 35 minutes later, you poop out of the clouds and you're at Love Field. It's like magic. We did a fair amount of IFR flying. I was relatively comfortable with it. We would do, med crew training, we would go over as group, we would go over approach plates, anything that we could do eyes and ears wise to help the pilot focus on setting up the autopilot. We were familiar with the buttonology and which part of the autopilot, what each button made the aircraft do, what it was using as a reference to navigate. Sure. So overall, I would say that my comfort level was about a 9 out of 10 for being in an IFR environment.
All right. Interesting. Okay.
Well, I think we're kind of coming up to the next part where you were pretty much answering our next question that we kind of had. So like, were you at a point during this flight at that time, did you sense or start to feel that something wasn't quite right? Did you have that like spidey sense, or was it just ops normal?
It's one of those things, like it was until immediately it wasn't.
Okay.
And so, it was smooth sailing until a point where it began very rapid escalation. And that was, we were about 4 miles away from where the patient was. We were just flying right under the ceiling.
So you were still legal at this point, right? You're still flying VFR, going where you need to go, going to a scene flight.
Right.
Like not an airport. You're just going to an unknown LZ to get a patient.
Yeah. Now we were about 4 miles from the airport in that little town when the rest of this started taking place, which I think also added to that false sense of security. But there's a rain shower. We had this solid layer of clouds, but that light rain reduced visibility. And so recognizing that, the pilot made the decision, and we'll get back to this part in a little bit. Pilot made the decision that he was going to pick up his IFR clearance, punch into the clouds, and shoot the approach to the airport, and ask the nurse in the back to call our comm center and let them know that that's what we were going to do. So basically ask the ambulance to bring the patient to the airport because we were going to shoot the approach into the airport.
Got it.
And so that was about the time where like I started to sense we're probably not doing the best thing because it seemed a little bit rushed. It seemed like we didn't really talk about it before it happened. But at the same time, I'm sitting in the front and I'm looking over my left shoulder and I literally saw blue sky, like clear blue sky. And my thought was, we can go fly around over here and talk about this, or we can fly around over here and set up the autopilot, or we don't have to commit to this rain shower, this cloud right now. And again, like this is going to come back up later, but I voiced that I wasn't comfortable. And I just said, I'm not comfortable with this. And that's all I said. I didn't want to stress the guy out anymore. I didn't want to add further decision-making to what he was doing. And so I left it at that. We punched into the clouds. In that aircraft, there's part of the autopilot that's in the, would be in between the pilot and the co-pilot seat. And then there's another part that has to do with climb rate that's on the other side of the controls. And so, you have to focus on one area, then you have to focus on the other area. So we set the aircraft to go into a climb. He starts setting up the autopilot. I don't know how high we were, but he tried to contact air traffic control. I guess we weren't high enough to get him. So, but he continued to try to contact them as we were still in this climb. And so I'm starting to think, all right, are we going fast enough? Now I'm starting to second guess all these things, right?
Sure.
And so, tension's building, air traffic control's not talking to us. The nurse in the back's not really saying anything. But I'm watching the gauges, right? So because we've done this training about how to tell if you're upright and all the things when you're flying instruments. And, I noticed some discrepancies on some of the gauges. And at this point, it's difficult to get anything out. But then at some point, we felt this shuddering in the aircraft, and you look, and anytime that you see the HSI or you see brown up, that's not a good thing. Then I look over at the vertical speed indicator, and it shows like it's pegged down. The altimeter you see in the movies, it's just spinning like a top. And I'm like,
Wow.
okay, this is it. Like there's nothing that we're going to do to get out of this. Like it's over. And so
Wow.
at that point, fast forward, we were about 6,000 or 7,000 feet in the air at that point. I'm sitting there, there's nothing I can do. So I'm like, get right with the Lord, right? So
Yeah.
we somehow were nose down, punched out of the clouds. The pilot was able to get the nose up. We hit the ground belly first, slid for some significant amount of distance. Thank God it had been raining. Slid in this field, rolled the aircraft over, and it came to rest on the side where I was. So basically, the doors were ripped off, the nose was all gone, and so basically, I'm laying on the ground. It's kind of the way that it came to rest. It's probably 5,000 feet in the air when I recognized like this. There's like we're done, we're toast, and like luck. That like it didn't have anything to do with skill. It didn't have anything to do with being able to navigate the aircraft or control the aircraft. Like it was pure luck that we all survived, right? And so, so that was good, right? That was it. So the impact, I got knocked out. Like I still have my helmet. I should have brought it actually, but I still have my helmet from that flight. But there's like paint marks on it, and if you look from that seating position where you would find red paint, it's a long way from the seat. But
Really,
my head and helmet found it. But yeah, so I don't know if you want to stop there and ask questions.
Well, I kind of wanted to back up just for a moment where you were talking about where you noticed that rain shower, right? So you noticed that was reducing the visibility, right? And the pilot, and correct me if I'm wrong, was already going to initiate the IFR flight plan, right? And you said you guys were already going into you're going into that shower and going into a climb because knowing you're losing that visibility at that point. Is that correct?
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
Yeah, just before that, this statement was made that, we were going to continue along the path of a highway. Like the visibility was still good.
Right.
Like we still had ground reference. He deviated a little bit to start setting up the autopilot before actually turning into the cloud.
For our listeners that don't know, or people that might not be familiar with IFR, like when we talk about, when you said, when you do your briefs and you talk about, hey, if we're a VFR, we're not quite taking off in an IFR, but we have that as the option, right, to transition into that. It sounds like you guys were still doing everything right. Everything that you talk about, that you planned for, you were doing, right? I'm going to climb because I know we're going to lose our visibility. We're going to file that IFR flight plan, and we're going to stabilize and then figure out where we're going to go. And it sounds like that's what you talked about. We're going to go to this airport because we can do the approach here, radio the ground crew to then move the patient from the scene to go to that airport. So still at that time, everything's going according to plan and doing what you would brief about and what you talk about. So for those listeners that aren't familiar with that can be that plan when you transition from the VFR into the IFR. You have your alternate destination, you're doing a climb, and you're making sure you're level and making those radio calls out to let them know where you're going and where to bring the patient. And that's all correct, right?
That's exactly right.
So still normal. And like you said, everything was normal until it wasn't.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
somewhere in there, something happened where a loss of just, visual reference, I don't know. And you'll be able to explain a little bit more as you go, like kind of what the findings were of that. But from just a few moments, you were fine to now have impacted the ground. You said you were about 6,000 or 7,000 feet, to now you're on the ground and you hit hard, you were knocked out. What was going through your mind really at that point when you came to afterwards? You noticed you were alive, but can you explain to us what was going through your mind at that time?
We always train for emergency shutdown and egress and all of these things.
Right.
Like, I don't know how long I was unconscious, but I do know that when I came to, I could still hear the engine running. Also, during that time, the pilot's seat had been ripped out of the aircraft. So I was laying on my side, and literally the pilot was standing on the ground, but was like, I was on my side. If he's standing up, he's across me. So I'm trying to shut down the engines and they won't shut down.
Yeah.
It's the aircraft was full FADEC. So everything was by switches, right? So there's they call them the popsicle sticks, the manual controls. But the impact pushed down the circuit breaker panel, and that impeded the ability to move those manual flight controls back. It also disconnected the electronics, and so the switches wouldn't work to turn the engines off. And so we're on our side. We still have at least one engine still running. So I recognized I was alive. Of course I can taste blood. I feel weird. So do the old, like, once over,
Right.
pat yourself down.
Yeah. Right.
My hands work. I'm touching everything, and I get about mid thigh, and I feel this weird knot. And I'm like, that's not right. Well, come to find out later, it was part of my patella had pulled up into my thigh. But the other part of it is at the time I was trying to lean, to get myself out, and I couldn't do it. And, again, fast forward, it was because my back was broken. And so I couldn't move. The pilot got himself out. The nurse got herself out. And meanwhile, the engines are still running. So now I'm sitting in this aircraft thinking, this thing's going to blow up, or there's going to be a fire, or what's
Right.
gonna happen. So, I left at 5 o'clock in the morning. The next thing that was on my mind is, I don't know how this is going to end, but I want my family to know that, like, I survived the crash part of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried calling, and since I was in the middle of nowhere, there was bad reception. So, the phone would pick up, but nobody could hear me. Call again. This is all from inside the aircraft. So I don't know how much time went by, but a farmer and his son that lived close by, they heard this happen. And so they came over, and the father and the son pulled me out of the little skylight window, and they were dragging me across the field. And they were like, I remember them saying, is this far enough? I can still hear the engine running. I was like, nope, keep going.
Yeah.
Go
Wow.
further. But like, I was trying to think, like, how can I let my family know that again, like, I made it through here. I don't know what kind of injuries I have. I don't know if I'm bleeding
Right.
inside, but I want them to know, like, what happened. Well, I tried calling, and 3 times nobody could hear me on the other end of the line. So I thought, as they were dragging me away, I took a photo of the aircraft and sent it to them in hopes that they would put together the fact that, I tried calling, that you got this from me, because I knew, like, somebody was going to call them, right? It wasn't going to be me. Somebody was going to get in touch with them, and they were going to have questions. And so I guess in my mind, I was trying to prepare them as best I could for that notification. And then, after that, everything was a little bit blurry, but it was pretty chaotic for a little bit. The ambulance took the patient that we were supposed to get to the local hospital. They came back and got me and the pilot, put us in the back. And I think the nurse rode in the front to the local hospital. And our thought then was, let's get us all x-rayed. Let's make sure that we don't have any internal bleeding or something that we have to address immediately, and then have our people from CareFlite, because we do ground ambulance too, right? So to have our people come out and get us to drive us back into Fort Worth Trauma Center, which is probably a 2-hour drive.
Wow.
From where we were back to Fort Worth. So that's kind of the initial thought process and the way things went at the scene.
Yeah, you're kind of describing how everything's kind of happening through, from the time you guys realized something was wrong, feeling that shuddering in the aircraft. And I know you said you were at 6,000 feet, and probably only a couple seconds until the rest of it transpired from there. But I'm sure time through all of this probably had to stand still for you, just kind of thinking through this whole process, the fact that you can remember each of these little details along the way. I can't imagine being in your shoes during all of that. And it's just, like I said, so impactful to hear, like, what, and amazing to me as well, like what the brain remembers in those moments, and what kind of things you're thinking about, and how you're right to thinking about, family and wanting to make sure that they know that you're okay. And that, oh shit moment of, all right, I am still here, right? Like I'm still alive. It's just amazing to hear kind of what was going through your mind during that whole process. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
That gave me chills, Rhett, about you saying you were able to at least take a photo.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Try to send that to him. I can't even imagine if I was even one in that position, and if I sent my wife a photo of a crashed helicopter that I was just in, and she got that photo with no other context to that. If I made it out of that, I would have another whole survival story to get through, to send that and not have any context. But I think it goes to show where your mind is at those moments. And like you were just trying to make sure, like, hey guys, if I don't get to a point to tell you this, at least know this was the steps immediately after, and that I'm okay right now. Here it is. Like to be able to get that out, that's the thought process that you had was pretty incredible.
That was kind of crazy. Well, we're certainly glad that you're okay from the crash itself, and were able to make it out, as well as all of the rest of your crew. It's a truly incredible story to hear what you went through on that particular day. And I imagine you said, you ended up having a broken back. You had a patellar issue. I'm sure there was probably a couple other injuries involved in there, but you went to the hospital to get checked out. And I can only imagine how long of a recovery process this was for you from there. If you're able to talk a little bit about like what it was like for you in kind of the hours, months, or days, months after that, and kind of what that process looked like for you.
So yeah, from the scene, we got taken to the local hospital. For anybody who's in air EMS, everybody has the quintessential rural hospital that you go to. That's sometimes is more of a rescue mission.
Right.
Yes. I'm not going to say that, but I would say we traditionally take a lot of patients out of that facility. So we weren't expecting like trauma center level care, right? Again, we wanted to get the basics.
Yep.
Diagnose anything that's going to kill us right now, and then get us out of here. And so, we got x-rayed. One of our clinical leaders she was a flight nurse, picked up one of our flight medics in her own personal car, drove down there. This guy, he was kind of a macho combat medic kind of guy. So he winds up, quote unquote, commandeering the local ambulance and tells them, hey, you drive. They put the pilot and me back in there, and we start booking it to Fort Worth by ground. And so in the course of that,
and you said that's like 2 hours, like a 2-hour drive?
It's quite a trip. But so luckily, my buddy is very aggressive in his clinical practices, we'll say, gave me most of the narcotics that I carried in my pouch. So,
good man. Fair enough. Good man.
Fair enough.
The ride to Fort Worth was a blur, as was the next several days. When the dust all settled, I had an L1 burst fracture, which is why I couldn't move while I was in the aircraft, because it pinched my spinal cord. I had multiple transverse process fractures throughout my thoracic and lumbar spine. My patella got ripped in half. So I didn't hit anything. It was just from the force of my feet being on the deck and the impact, like me bracing for impact, pushing my feet down, where my quadricep tendon and patellar tendon ripped my patella in half. And then my left ankle was broken also. So that was the original injuries. So we get to Fort Worth, we all get separated, and we have a helicopter based at that hospital. We have a great relationship with people in the ER. And so it really hit home for everybody, our crews, the nursing staff, the doctors in the hospital. And so it was kind of a very intense, all hands on deck, to make sure that we got the VIP treatment, if you will. And so again, like that part was pretty much a blur. The goings-ons, went from the ER, spent that first night in the ICU, and then they started the next day doing surgeries, which the first one was to clean out the debris in my spine and fix that. And so the first approach they did, they went in from the front to clean out debris and stuff like that. In doing that, they had to take out one of my ribs to make a bigger window to go clean everything out. And during that first surgery, I went into DIC. So they had to stop that surgery.
Yeah.
I spent the next 8 days intubated in the ICU, being pumped full of blood products and diuresis, over that time. Then they went back in, finished the spinal surgery. The next day, I guess I was extubated for about 3 or 4 days. And then they went in and did my knee. And then I spent another 2 days at that hospital there. And then another month at a rehab hospital.
Wow.
But, one of the people ask, what's the worst part of this whole thing? Like being in a helicopter crash has to be horrible. What's the worst thing? And the worst thing is being extubated.
Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
So yeah, just because you're coming off the sedation, they're testing your ability to breathe on your own. So that was really the first conscious thing that I really remembered, in that time span. And I didn't know that it had been 8 days. But yeah, and I tell people that are in this industry because to be more sympathetic of the patients that you're taking care of that are maybe not sedated enough, is how tough that is to be in that position. Just that's kind of a little side note there. So then it was, a month in a rehab hospital, and that's a humbling experience, right? Because at the time this was about 12 and a half years ago. I was young, and I'm in a facility that's, people with hip replacements, knee replacements, a lot of older population.
Yeah, right. They're like, what are you here for? I was just in a helicopter crash. How do you have that conversation?
And I'm in there, right? 35 years old, prime of my life, and I'm moving clothespins up and down a stick. That's right. That's what I was doing. No, exactly. Yeah. So, but it's pretty humbling.
I have no doubt.
To be in a position like that after you've been extremely active.
Wow.
So
I can't imagine going through that. I think we're all, at least in this industry, we're very independent, not just thinkers, but doers. And have to suddenly be dependent upon somebody else or be on the other side of the curtain, if you will, right? It's got to be a difficult experience for any one of us to go through. I know for a fact, I pity the people that ever have to take care of me in the hospital because I know that I'm not going to be a good patient. And I know it's going to be a difficult process for them. But
we go in with the best of intentions, but I was told after the fact that I was pretty tough on the ER nurses and some of the ICU nurses.
Hopefully you've patched up that relationship since then.
Right. I've done my best.
Perfect. So imagine, obviously this has been a crazy couple months for you. You're trying to work through everything, and the physical stuff is one aspect of it, but obviously there's a whole other component that we haven't really touched on yet, and certainly want to talk about a little bit more as far as the emotional and mental side of things. But what would you say that your support was like, whether that be from friends, family, agency, immediately after the crash and through the whole recovery process?
So yeah, immediately after, in the days and a couple weeks, especially being at the big trauma center hospital, there's tons of support, right? You've got friends, family, people from work, friends of people from work, like people coming out of the woodworks, almost to the point where there's too much. There's
Right.
too much going on. It's still great to have, knowing that there's people and resources available. But it's, when you're in the hospital, it's just, you have somebody there. If
Right.
they're not there, they're a stone's throw away. And again, like from my room where I was at in the hospital, 3 floors above that, we had our crew quarters. And so any crew that came and flew a patient in, they would come down there.
Yeah, you probably have visitors 24/7.
Yeah, they'd be there all the time, Then you go from there. Then the rehab hospital I went to was closer to home for me, which is probably an hour away from Fort Worth. There was still the support and, people coming and helping out. But it was not as much as it was there at the trauma center. And then even less going after that month of being there. And again, I mean, everybody has lives, right? So,
Right.
it's easy to do for a couple of days, but a month into it, it turns into more of a commitment, and
Right.
the help starts kind of waning off. But when I got back home, there was much less. And also on top of that, there's the personal, the feeling is, you're in an environment where you have, no matter what kind of help you need, it's there at a moment's notice. And then you remembering how broken you were then and still like physically broken and needing assistance in doing things, you go into an environment now where you have very limited help.
Right.
The help that's there was amazing and great, but that's, I guess, when it starts, everything slows down and it starts becoming more of an emotional and psychological thing than the physical parts of it, right? Because now, after being in a rehab hospital, learning to walk with a walker, building some physical strength, a little bit of independence, at this point, when I get home, I'm fairly capable of moving myself from a wheelchair to like a bench type seat or something like that. So that's my independence,
Right.
newfound independence. But then as being like young and active, that's when it starts getting frustrating too, right? Because there's so many things that you want to do and you're confined to a bed, or, you have to think 5 steps ahead of what you want to do.
Sure.
If you want to walk or if you want to move or you want to get from one room to the
Everything's
other.
a process at that point.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, my house was only like kitchen and living area downstairs and all the bedrooms were upstairs, as were both of the bathrooms that had showers. So, but kind of a shining moment in that is the base where my full-time helicopter was at a fire station. And so they were like our family. And so those guys, the fire department, they came and they built me a shower in my garage.
Wow.
So
that's awesome.
So
Wow.
it was weird explaining when we sold that house.
Right.
Why is there a shower
Why
in
is
the
there a
garage?
shower in the garage?
So, but I mean, that was a lifesaver, right? Because I couldn't
Right.
get upstairs. So I got home early November was when they finally let me go home. And I didn't make it up the stairs and sleep in my own bed until Christmas Eve.
Wow.
So, we go from the end of September to almost the end of December
Wow.
that I hadn't been upstairs in my house.
I think that's something, just what you're touching on there is something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily recognizes or anticipate coming is that new normal, and how you figure out what that new normal is, and how do you work. I mean, you went through a major event, and your team went through a major event, and you have to get to that point where you're like, all right, so this is where it's at for right now. This is what I'm doing, and accept that fact. That's got to be something, did you ever find yourself in those moments just kind of going through the stages and just, finding yourself at the point where you're just like, I am absolutely angry that this happened, or
100%,
how do you process some of those feelings that you're going through? Because I imagine that I would feel very frustrated not being able to do those things for myself, or not being able to just walk up the stairs, or just go get a shower, or those little things as you're going through that. And I can't imagine, where your mind was at.
Yeah. And, by that point, I'd had a lot of time to think and to process things, but, my first recollection, when I first woke up from being intubated for several days, I was pissed. I was like, it was personal, right? I was like,
right.
These people tried to do this to me. And that's just the way you're thinking, right? Like, these people did this to me.
Yeah.
And you're angry and you're mad and you're putting blame, and, you can do that and you can let it eat you up. Or me, and I think a lot of us are this way, like, we want to know the why behind something. Like, how did something happen? We want to take it apart.
For sure.
And so that's what I started doing, right? And I was taking apart, like, how do we get in that position? What was the pilot doing? What was I doing? What was the nurse doing? What could we have done different? And play it over and over and over and over. And rarely ever is it one singular thing that is outside of any of our control, right? And
sure.
That was what pushed me to, like, I wouldn't say like reinvigorate, but I had a mission to come back and make sure that nobody else at my company was put in that position. Like, I wanted everybody in my company to have the tools to not let that situation escalate to where it did. And then, beyond that, I want the same for everybody in this industry. And so I want to do what I can. And hence part of the reason why I'm here talking to y'all today is, like, I want people to understand that everything's normal until it's not. And you have to pick out not what is going to lead to an accident, but what could lead to an accident. Because we do things that could lead to an accident every day, but they don't. And so we write them off as it's just normal ops.
No, you're 100% correct.
So I was mad. I kind of pieced it all together. And then, I think we can talk a little bit about, like, transitioning back into what that new normal is. But I really, I guess, I went through it enough times where I understood it. And I went from, this company hates me and they tried to kill me, to, like, I understand what my role in this was. And I understand where the personal failures on my part, on the pilot's part, and then the organizational failures too. Like, I understand all of the things that go into that, and I want to be part of what fixes it. Again, for my company and for the industry. And so, that helped to kind of pull me back in and gave me kind of a new purpose and, a voice, because you can listen to people teach about things all the time, right? But if you hear it from somebody who's been in that position, where you can go in as an instructor and say, well, if this and if that and this, and you can write them off and say, oh yeah, this guy. But if you hear it from somebody that says, I'm telling you that the fact that I drove 100 miles to get to a base that I'd never been to was a factor in my mind, and my inability to effectively communicate with that pilot was my role in this accident happening. And, and I tell everybody I talk to, if I had better explained my rationale of I'm not comfortable with this, I could have prevented that accident from happening. But at the time, I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the resource. I didn't have the confidence. And, complacency had snuck in on all of us. And that's all it takes is a little bit of that to to start that ball rolling.
Can you talk a little bit about then what the investigation or part of that NTSB process? Because I want to bring this up because not only are you recovering physically and mentally from this incident, then there's this whole process that has to come about at some point, right? This whole ongoing investigation, like when you talked about how do we uncover the whys and to be part of how did this happen, why did this happen, and how we fix that. Now here comes the other part of it, right? The whole NTSB process. Can you explain a little bit about how that, like kind of when that process started and kind of how that transpired, not only from you recovering at the same time, and how that alluded to uncovering some of the whys behind this incident and how that, kind of brought that more clear to you to where you have these realizations. These were the roles that we all had in this.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Valor Flight Crew podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories that promote the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Lastly, stand by for a message from our sponsors.
Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
Thank you to our sponsor, Spectrum AeroMed. Spectrum AeroMed is your trusted partner in air medical solutions. Experience safety and innovation with their customized interiors, designed for both rotor and fixed-wing aircraft. Elevate your patient care with Spectrum AeroMed. For more information, visit spectrum-aeromed.com.
Thanks for tuning in for part 1 of Surviving the Unthinkable, Rhett Draehn's journey. His incredibly powerful story is one that will stick with us forever. We are beyond grateful that Rhett willingly shared this story with all of us, and know the impact that this will have on the industry. While we hope that none of us will ever find ourselves in Rhett's shoes, his experience is a great reminder that we can never let our guard down. Recognizing and mitigating risks, and utilizing proper crew resource management is always of the utmost importance. We hope you found this discussion as enlightening as we did, and make sure you tune in next week for part 2 of this episode, where we discuss more of Rhett's journey, his lessons learned, and how we can continue to make the HEMS industry safer. Until then, fly safe everyone, and we'll see you next week with more amazing discussion with Rhett, and how his experience took him from tragedy to being a leader in industry safety.